Hey, how's it going, everyone? I'm Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Leo and Leo rising for the month of February of 2019. So tonight I'm doing a bit of an experiment, and I'm live streaming each of my horoscopes as I record them to YouTube and to Twitter and to Facebook at the same time. So for those of you watching the live streaming version, welcome. Please, if you have any questions, just post them in the chat, and I'll see if I can answer them later as we get through this. So I'm going to be looking at the transits this month for the month of February, especially for those of you with Leo rising, although you can also look at my horoscopes from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night. So here is the calendar for the month, which shows the ingresses of the planets and the dates that they move into different signs. It also shows the two lunations, which is the new moon in Aquarius and the full moon in Virgo, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this monthly horoscope. The other chart I wanted to show this month is the planetary movements calendar, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and where they will end up by the very end of the month, which is useful in terms of seeing not just which houses the planets are going through, but also how fast they'll go through certain houses during the course of the month, with the inner planets moving very quickly and the outer planets moving relatively slowly. All right, so the main chart, though, that I wanted to look at is the Solar Fire Animate chart feature, where I'm going to be looking at the exact planetary transits over the course of the next few weeks for February. All right, so here I have the chart set for the first day of the month, for February 1st, with Leo rising, to give you the vantage point of looking at all of the transits relative to your rising sign and relative to the 12 whole sign houses that the planets will be moving through and ingressing into over the course of the month. So there's a couple of things I should maybe get out of the way at the beginning of this. First, we're not focused very much on outer planet transits this month, because there's not a lot of major outer planet activity that's really notable in terms of planetary stations or ingresses or other things like that. Uranus will ingress into Taurus here pretty soon, but that's not until next month, so we'll kind of have to save that discussion for a little bit later on. So instead what we're going to focus on is primarily inner planet transits this month, because those are going to be the ones that actually change signs and move into new houses, and that's actually going to characterize most of the energy this month in terms of what makes February distinct from other months during the course of this year, like March or April or May or what have you. So let's jump right into that. One of the major distinctions in terms of inner planet transits this month is Mars and its transit through Aries during the first half of the month versus its transit through Taurus in the second half of the month. So here we can see on February 1st that Mars starts out the beginning of the month at 21 degrees of Aries, transiting through your ninth house of education, travel, foreign matters, like places that are foreign or foreign people from foreign countries other than where you started out in. So this is a transit I talked about a lot with Cam White last month during my horoscopes for January, so I don't need to dwell on it too much here, except to say that that transit of Mars through that house will continue to characterize the first half of the month, and eventually it peaks or culminates with a conjunction of Mars and Uranus in your ninth house around February 12th, February 13th. So that's the last sort of hurrah, or the last gasps of Uranus going through Aries and going through your ninth house, which has been happening since 2010 and 2011, which again is another long-term outer planet transit that I talked about. For some of you, Uranus going through your ninth was about majorly shaking up your belief systems so that what you believe and how you see the world may be much different now on the other end of this transit compared to what it was like when you first went in. And for some of you, your belief system may be so radically different that you wouldn't necessarily even recognize yourself at this point in your life compared to where you started 7 or 8 years ago, around 2010, 2011. So the Uranus transit through the ninth sometimes pertains to belief, other times it pertains to education and learning and knowledge, and some of the changes that have happened for you in the context of that. For other people, it has to do with travel to foreign places and exposure to different cultures as a sort of educational or learning sort of avenue unto itself as well. And some of the ways that exposure to other cultures can sometimes radically change your own beliefs and your own worldview. In other instances, it can manifest very literally in like experiences that you have in foreign countries that radically changes your life in some significant way. So that's part of what that this Mars transit is actually accentuating, as Mars is the last major planet that really hits Uranus before Uranus departs from that sign, completes that decade-long transit, and moves into Taurus here next month in March. So for some of you with day charts, that Mars transit to Uranus could be a little bit problematic or a little bit explosive. Mars, for example, sometimes has to do with feelings of strife or conflict. So there could be some sort of strife or conflict within the context of your beliefs or your educational system as it's currently instituted. For other people, it could be some sort of challenge that you run into during the course of a traveling or a journey, since the 9th house is also the place of long distance travel. Whatever it is, it's definitely good to avoid doing things impulsively this month, which is going to be hard because that energy of Mars and Uranus together at 29 degrees of Aries is nothing if not impulsive. So that sort of energy is going to characterize the first half of the month, but then that changes pretty abruptly starting around February 14th when Mars moves into Taurus and ingresses into your 10th house of career and life direction and reputation. So Mars transits the 10th house can sometimes be periods in which you just expend a ton of additional energy or more energy than normal on matters pertaining to your career and your overall life direction, which ultimately can be really constructive, where you can get more done than you usually get done. You can make a lot of great accomplishments that result from just having put in the work. So for those of you, especially with night charts, I would expect the more constructive side of that transit to really manifest itself in that way of putting in a lot of work and energy, but then eventually reaping the rewards. For some of you, especially those of you with night or with day charts, it could be a little bit more problematic because sometimes that excess energy that a transit like that brings with it can kind of boil over and lead to things like irritation or strife or separation within the context of one's career. So for some people, this can just be like irritation in the workplace or getting into a conflict with a superior. For other people, it can be some sort of separation or severing within the context of one's job or one's career. And in some instances, that can mean like having to leave one's job or one's career and move on to something else. So obviously sometimes that's necessary and constructive, and even though it's not always fun, it can be like a necessary thing to do. In other instances, it can be kind of like an unwelcome change or an unwelcome separation. So one of the tips for that is just to be careful about doing things too impulsively, just because the sort of inclination that you might have this month is definitely going to be much more towards the sort of spectrum of being more impulsive rather than less impulsive when it comes to your actions in general and your career in particular. So just try to restrain yourself to some extent and don't do anything that you're necessarily going to regret in the long term once you're in a more comfortable sort of frame of mind. All right, so that is the Mars transit that's happening there through your 10th house, and that pretty much takes you through the second part of February. Because as we can see, Mars keeps going through Taurus for the rest of the month, and it only gets to about 10 degrees of Taurus by March 1st. So that Mars transit through your 10th house of career is really going to carry over pretty far into March, although it's certainly that ingress is a major shift that occurs here starting around February 13th, February 14th. Other major transits this month, Venus is going to be moving through your 6th house for most of the month. So last month we really focused on Venus conjoining Jupiter in the middle of Sagittarius and some of the positive stuff that came along with that. Let's see. Hold on a sec. And we had the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, which was beautiful in the morning sky in the night, but then that's pretty much over at this point by late January, and Venus is getting ready to move into Capricorn. So Venus moves into Capricorn by February 3rd, and then it spends pretty much the rest of the month transiting through that sign. Eventually, Venus catches up with Saturn and conjoins it at 16 degrees of Capricorn around February 17th. Then it keeps going and conjoins Pluto around 22 Capricorn on February 22nd. And then eventually Venus squares Uranus at 29 degrees of Capricorn to 29 Aries just before it leaves the sign and moves into Aquarius and goes into your 7th house, which ends up being one of the major transits that's going to happen in March. So in terms of this month, Venus transiting through your 6th house is going to be one of the major transits for you. The 6th house is the place of work, so it has to do with your workplace. It has to do with health matters and sometimes matters that pertains to like cultivating your health and maintaining good health and what it takes to maintain good health versus sometimes what it takes to ward off illness or what it takes to avoid sort of bad health, let's say. So Venus's transit through your 6th, from my perspective, is actually a pretty positive transit because it's going to be counterbalancing some of the other more long-term challenging transits that you might already be experiencing in that area of your chart, which is partially from things like the outer planet transit of Pluto that's been going through there for a long time, but more importantly, the transit of Saturn, which has been going through Capricorn and going through your 6th house for over a year now, since it went into Capricorn in December of 2017. So here we see Saturn going through your 6th house, and Saturn at the beginning of the month is already halfway through the sign. It's at 15 degrees of Capricorn, and that can be a much more long-term, which I've talked about in previous months' horoscopes, transit that can have to do with like restrictions or challenges that come up within the context of either your workplace or within the context of health, and sometimes setbacks. But with Venus ingressing into this sign, one of the functions of the benefic planets like Venus is that sometimes they can counteract or they can indicate and become kind of representative of the antidote or the counterbalance, the remediation, which can help to solve the problems that the malefic planets like Saturn or Mars indicate. So to me, part of what this Venus transit is about this month is finding the counterbalance to some of the challenges, or finding some of the way to resolve some of the challenges that Saturn has brought up as it's been transiting through your 6th house over the course of the past year. So for some of you, this may indicate like a temporary respite when it comes to issues you've been dealing with and obstacles or conflicts in some instance with respect to your workplace. Like if you've been having problems with your job, or if you've been having problems finding work, Venus going in there and conjoining Saturn, especially around the middle of the month, could temporarily alleviate some of those challenges that you've been experiencing over the course of the past few months, or the course of the past 12 months, I should say. So that's going to be especially the case for those of you with night charts, because on the one hand, I would expect the Saturn transit through your 6th has probably been more challenging for those of you with night charts over the past year. But on the other hand, the ingress of Venus into your 6th, Venus would be the more positive or the most positive planet for you based on the concept of sect, which means that the potential for this transit is much more positive as an alleviating factor for those of you with night charts. For those of you with day charts, it's probably going to be not as notable, but the challenges that you've experienced in terms of Saturn going through your 6th house has also probably not been as significant as it could be either, so you're probably a little bit less in need of remediation than could be the case otherwise. All right, so I talked about that and contextualized that transit partially in terms of work. The other area is, of course, health. So for some of you, Venus going through the 6th house can be a great time to try to focus more on your health and try to focus more on doing things that could positively improve your health in ways that are deliberate and constructive. So Venus like Saturn sometimes likes to, when it goes through a certain house of your chart, can really stir up a lot of problems in different ways. So if there's some sort of health issue that you've been dealing with that's coincided with that Saturn transit, Venus can sometimes represent looking into a new avenue for an option that you haven't tried yet to resolve that. So for some of you, that can be trying to address a specific issue that's been going on already. For others, it can be more preventative in terms of like trying to focus on your health more, trying to focus on ways that you could clean up or improve health matters that could become an issue in the long term, even if they haven't so far, or haven't manifested that way so far. So I would definitely recommend taking advantage of that, especially around the time of the Venus-Saturn conjunction, around the middle of the month. But really, that transit is in effect for the entirety of February, starting around February 3rd or February 4th. Does anybody have any questions? I'm just realizing that I haven't checked the chat in a little while, so let me take a look at that just to see what's going on. It looks like we have a lot of Leo rising people joining today. Hey, everybody. Somebody is looking forward to Uranus going back in their 10th. That's good. It can definitely be a really innovative and positively, certainly unexpected, but a very constructive transit in some instances. They said that they got a promotion at work when that happened. Somebody says, does the 6th house have anything to do with mental health? Yeah, that can definitely be the case, especially if, I know there's some people that deal with like hereditary mental health issues, and that can definitely be a 6th house matter if it's something that you inherited or is something that's like biologically motivated in some way. Then certainly having a transit like Venus going through the 6th house, especially in a night chart, could indicate some positive remediation of that, like starting to see a new mental health professional or somebody who helps you to cope with that, not in isolation, but instead through interacting and working with somebody else. Somebody asked if they were born at 5:30 a.m. in the month of August, or do you have a day or night chart? You'd have to calculate the chart and see if the sun is above or below the horizon, but I'm guessing at 5:30 in the morning, there's a pretty good chance that it was still below the horizon and you'd have a night chart, but you'd have to calculate the chart exactly. Somebody on YouTube said they've been researching diets for the past week and was planning to starting next month. That would be a great application of this transit. That's exactly the type of thing that I was talking about when it comes to that, in terms of proactive things that you could do focusing on the 6th house. So like diet or exercise regimes are really great constructive uses of 6th house transits or other 6th house activations. I remember a few years ago when I went into a 6th house profection year, I started going to the gym and kind of trying to improve my health in general. And that seemed to be like a proactive use of using the energy and sort of working with it to whatever extent you can, versus waiting for it to sort of happen to you. Somebody asked, if you were born on a cusp, do we belong to both horoscopes or to none? If you're born on a cusp, it's one or the other. So you just need to calculate the exact time that you were born, and then the planet and everything will be in either one sign or the other, and then you pay attention to the sign that it's in, not the other sign. Okay. Somebody says they have a packed 6th house mainly with outer planets. Is February a good time to start a new project? It depends on what the outer planets are, but Venus transiting through there and hitting most of those typically is not going to be a negative thing. So in most instances, yeah, that would be a positive time. Legal issues, not sure. I'm not sure that would relate to any of the houses that we've talked about so far. Okay, let me go back, because I did want to focus on a few other transits before I get too sidetracked. So I've talked about, I've talked about Mars and Mars's shift from your 9th house to your 10th house. I've talked about Venus and its shift from your 5th house to your 6th house. The other thing I meant to touch on before we get too far afield is the 2 lunations, which is the new moon and the full moon. So there's a new moon that takes place in Aquarius in your 7th house of relationships, so it represents a new beginning for relationships on the 4th of February. Then there's a full moon that takes place in your 2nd house of finances in Virgo on the 19th of February. So the new moon in your 7th house of relationships, of course, is representing some sort of new beginning or new development in your life with respect to relationships. Sometimes it can be the start of meeting a new person and like literally starting a new relationship. Other times it can be starting a new phase in an existing relationship. So you guys are coming out of a couple of years of eclipses bouncing back and forth between your 1st and 7th house already. So you've already kind of been through a lot of this recently, and a lot of that energy is still going to be coming off of those eclipses at this point. So I don't want to overplay this, because having what is now just a new moon and is not a solar eclipse in your 7th house is certainly going to be probably a bit less exciting and a bit less momentous than some of those eclipses have been over the past couple of years. But it can still represent a new stage in your relationships that starts out kind of slowly and builds up and gains momentum and gains steam over the course of the next 7 months, until eventually you have a full moon that takes place in that house 6 months from now, and you see the results of whatever was initiated at this time start to come to fruition. So pay attention to new developments and new beginnings in relationships this month, especially around February 4th, because something which is initiated at that time that seems relatively insignificant could become much more significant later on. The other lunation we have this month is that full moon that's taking place in Virgo in your 2nd house. So let me actually animate the chart to show all of the alignments for that full moon. So there it is, full moon in Virgo in your 2nd house, and this is happening in the house of finances. So this represents some sort of culmination of events with trends and themes that have been developing in your life with respect to your finances for the past 6 months, and they eventually come to culmination at this point, where something that you began last year, 5 or 6 months ago now, when there was a new moon in Virgo, that was probably a minor development or a slow development with respect to money or possessions or the way that you spend and handle money in your life, is now reached a sort of critical turning point where it's sort of matured, and it's started to become much more significant in the role that it's playing. So this could be a positive development. It could also be a negative development. It really depends on how your chart is set up. But the important point is just that you'll start to notice potentially the changes with respect to your finances at this time, around the time of the new moon, around February 19th. And if that's like a good development or a good trend and it's headed in a good direction, then just keep doing what you're doing after this point. However, if you notice or you see something that's happening at this time that you don't like, or that's like a habit that you've gotten into with your finances that's maybe not constructive, then this would be an important point to sort of like hit the brakes and try to change that habit before it gets ingrained any further. Because if you don't, then it's going to become more of a permanent fixture in your life after this point compared to before. So, and that's the 2nd lunation, which is happening around February 19th. Let's see, other major transits that I meant to focus on this month. Those are the 4 main ones. The only other one is that we're getting ready for a Mercury retrograde next month that's going to happen in Pisces, and that's going to conjoin Neptune a couple of times. And it looks like that's going to take place in your 8th house. So let me animate the chart. See, what happens here is we have a Mercury-Neptune conjunction around February 18th, which normally would just like come and go, and that's the end of it. But what happens is that Mercury starts slowing down by the end of February, and it stations retrograde at 29 degrees of Pisces in early March, and then it retrogrades all the way back and stations direct, conjoining Neptune at the end of March. So I'm going a little far afield here, and I don't want to get too much into March, into next month's horoscope, but I wanted to bring this up because Mercury is going to enter its retrograde shadow pretty much right around the time that it conjoins Neptune, which means that some of the events and circumstances surrounding the Mercury retrograde are actually going to put themselves in place in the second half of February. So for you guys with Leo rising, this is taking place in your 8th house of shared finances and other people's, or shared resources and other people's money. So this can have to do with like your partner's money, either a romantic partner or a business partner. It can have to do with issues pertaining to taxes, issues pertaining to debt or inheritance or other matters like that. The 8th house also has to do with issues pertaining to mortality. But one of the things that you could potentially run into it as an issue is like miscommunication or communication that's not clear with respect to those topics at this time. And one of the things that you're going to want to do is really strive for clear communication as much as you possibly can when it comes to these topics starting in mid-February. Because if there is the potential for miscommunication in any of these dealings, then that's probably what you will experience if you're not extremely careful. So if you have any like business dealings or other financial dealings at this time, starting in the second half of February that deal with other people, just exercise greater caution than usual because the potential for miscommunication is much greater than at other times. That's what I would say. All right, so those are the major interplanet transits that I really wanted to focus on this month. Does anybody have any questions as we're getting towards the end of this and getting ready to wrap things up? Let me take a look at the chat. Somebody asked, will Venus have no mediation effect for day charts? No, Venus will have some mediation effect for day charts. It just won't be as positive as it could be. It's not, Venus for people with day charts is positive. It's still a benefic planet, but it's not quite as benefic as it could be. But the good news, is that for people with day charts, Saturn is not as problematic as it could be. So there's not as much for Venus to clean up when it moves into your 6th house as there would be otherwise, is kind of the trick there. But it does have some remediating effect. Okay. Somebody says that they've been trying to make a habit of packing their lunches instead of spending money or eating out. That's a good sort of manifestation of some of the 2nd house stuff that could reach a culmination or a turning point at this point this month. Somebody said that they started doing budgets about 6 months ago, and they hope that the full moon tells them that they're doing a good job. That's definitely an important turning point to sort of like look back and reflect on that when you hit the full moon and see how it's going, and then see if that's something that you want to keep doing versus if there's any like alteration in your trajectory that you want to institute at that time would be a great thing to do in general. That's always good advice for the new moons and the full moons in terms of meditating on your current trajectory and altering it appropriately or accordingly. All right, any other questions? All right, cool. Well, I think that might be it then in terms of the horoscope for those of you with Leo and Leo rising for the month of February of 2019. Thanks everybody for joining me tonight. This is a lot of fun. This is a bit of an experiment doing a live stream, but so far so good. And I'm going to keep pushing through. I think if I can, I'm going to take a little break for dinner and then come back with a horoscope for Virgo. And then I'll be halfway through the zodiac and it's only almost 10 o'clock at night. So it's going to be a long night, but thanks everyone for joining in the chat because it's been a lot of fun so far. Make sure if you want to get notifications about next time I do a live stream to subscribe to me on YouTube. So it's youtube.com/theastrologyschool or on Twitter at Twitter. It's like at Chris Brennan 7 is my handle on Twitter. So tonight I live stream to all 3 places, and if this ends up being a success in retrospect, then I'll probably make it more of a major thing or more of a common regular thing. So the last website to check out, of course, is my podcast, which is theastrologypodcast.com. All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Good luck this month in February, and I'll see you again next month for the horoscopes for March of 2019. So signing off.